Maybe she carried the moon in her pocketbook and lions slept in her backyard because her voice suggested a strength and comeliness of an otherworldly queen. There was a liberating FU in every primal wail on the Shaka Khan record, and I started to gather my strength from there. I saw her on Solid Gold and Soul Train. She was a few years past her artistic prime in the mid-'80s, her voice clashing against trendy synthesizers, her massive purplish hair obscuring her face. I found a younger Shaka in the record's Daddy Left, the shapely chick with the mysterious eyes and leather and feathers, sitting gap-legged on a couch shaped like a pair of big red lips. I watched, as I always did, the label spinning on the turntable. The sun-yellow outer rings with the red and violet core worked like a hypnotic spiral as Shaka's brassy voice pulled me into a fool's paradise. I had no idea what she sang about. I didn't absorb lyrics then. The voice was all that mattered, and I wanted to be the sound, free and powerful, bold and assured. This was not the sound of a faggot. This was not the sound of a lonely and disliked person. Now that I had headphones, I could plug in and blast her defiant voice. I could close my eyes and become nothing. I could exhale and surrender to a woman who tamed lions in her backyard and kept a full moon somewhere in her purse. This recent meditation on one of my favorite singers, Shaka Khan. The context for this is 1986. I'm in the 4th grade, and at this time, I'm being bullied at school, called a faggot, and called a whole lot of other ugly slurs. Also in a very, very dysfunctional family. My parents have been divorced for about 3 years. My father, who was a troubled Vietnam vet, leaves me a treasure trove of records. And I'm listening to these albums and to these 45s in a way to stay connected with him. And in this treasure trove of music, there's Bobby Womack, there's Aretha Franklin, there's B.B. King, there's Rufus and Shaka Khan, Minnie Riperton, all these great soul acts who have long been canonized now. But at this time, I'm listening to it as a way to stay connected to him. But there's something that changes, that starts to turn in me in the 4th grade as I'm trying to come into my own and trying to find who I am. And I'm realizing that this activity is something that most young people do, is that they look in pop culture, look at pop music as a mirror, as it were. So it's kind of a narcissistic thing you're doing. You're looking for some reflection there. But I'm listening to these records and soul music and thinking I'm looking for my father, but I'm actually realize I'm looking for myself. Concurrently, there is this movement that's happening into the late 80s, into the early 90s as I'm coming of age. And it's some gangster rap. It's hip-hop. It's not a continuum of the soul music that sustained my parents, but it's another artistic movement that's happening. And it's accompanied with video, so it's much more powerful visually than the black artistic expression that had come before it. But it's problematic for me because I can't find myself in this mirror of hip-hop and gangster rap. And I'm also, at this time also the late 80s, early 90s, there's another thing that's happening here in the black community that is devastating. I grew up just down the street in Little Rock in these poor and poor but low to moderately income families. So I'm seeing the devastation of crack. I'm seeing the devastation of AIDS and HIV, and at that time, these were not manageable conditions in which they are now. I mean, these people died in this devastated communities. The soundtrack of all of this is this new music now that's bristling with all this angst, and it's very, very violent and misogynistic. It's basically extending a lot of pathological behaviors and pathological beliefs that are very American, but what hip-hop is doing at this time is intensifying it and putting a brown and black face on it. Meantime, I am this adolescent preteen trying to find my way here. I'm seeing all of the boys in the neighborhood and all of the boys at school appropriate a certain swagger, posture that I'm seeing in NWA and Snoop Dogg. And all of this is new. And all of this and this music is also illuminating a darkness and illuminating an angst that isn't totally new, but this is from a generation that is seeing for the first time the devastation of AIDS and HIV. They're seeing for the first time the devastation of drugs. Or parents not being in the home. My parents are split. My mother worked 2 full-time jobs. My sisters and I were sort of left to our own devices. And, over here is soul music. It's not making me the most popular kid in town because I'm listening to cassettes of Al Green and Marvin Gaye on the bus while everybody else is listening to Snoop Dogg. But there's something else that's happening with me over here as I'm coming of age and looking at this mirror, pop culture, and not seeing myself. I'm reaching back to a music that I didn't have the language to understand why this is resonating with me, but I do understand how, what happens to the room when this music comes on. At the card parties my parents had, or when relatives had barbecues, if there's an Al Green song, a Marvin Gaye song, or Earth, Wind, and Fire song comes on, there's something that happens that's almost akin to what I see in church. There's a release. There is dancing, and there's hands up in the air and testifying to, well, I lived through that. I know what you're talking about. There's a call and response to the music. And it wasn't until much later when I started to study formally that I understood what was happening in my neighborhoods growing up when this music came on, where the adults who had worked so hard and were so downtrodden and so tired and mean a lot of times, there was something that happened to them when Aretha was on. And this reaction was akin to what I had seen in church, but it was also inherent to soul music, which is a secularization of gospel. Gospel is about a communal sharing of an experience. Whether it's secularized or it's a spiritual one, it's hard times, we're going to get through it. There's a sense of transcendence and a sense of hope. This is an extension of the blues. This is also felt in jazz. But soul music is coming of age, or coming into the mainstream just as the civil rights movement is. So there's a soundtrack. There's a lot of brutality going on, but there's still this music, Curtis Mayfield, Aretha Franklin, and all these folks who were raised in church, who are going into the studios and going into nightclubs, singing songs that are steeped in the blues and jazz, but they are, whether it's in the lyric or in the delivery, communicating a sense of hope. They weren't talking about a queer little black boy in Little Rock, Arkansas, but I was able to take this music somehow, which had been a gift from my father. I don't think he knew it was a gift at the time, but it was something that was sustaining, that just it sustained my parents, sustained my grandparents through hard times. I'm not finding that over here in hip-hop and gangster rap. They're calling folks who look like my mother and sister bitches and hoes and tricks. I can't get with that. I don't understand why that is. I don't understand what that angst is coming from. How do we get from there to here? And where do I fit in the middle of this as all of this is going on? What's interesting enough is that, Dr. Dre's Chronic, which is now the soundtrack for this documentary that has come out when I'm going into high school, Banging in Little Rock, which chronicled the drug and alcohol, the drug and gang violence is going on. I'm seeing this every day because people are in the neighborhood who are addicted and who are victims of bystanders, drive-by shooters and all this. But on the soundtrack, he's sampling a lot of the music that's in my father's collection. But where this music, whether it's Parliament or Parliament or James Brown, where they're having messages that are about aspirations, about getting over, on top of this, these samples are lyrics that are taking us under in a way. I can't make this reconciliation. I don't know what to do. I'm not finding myself here. Also, I see this among my white peers in grunge. There's an angst there that is expressed that isn't necessarily a release. I'm like, this isn't a continuum of what had just come before this in pop culture in the 70s and 80s, where there was a, albeit romanticized, but still, we can get over. I'm not hearing that. So I'm going back over here to the soul records. I'm coming of age. But my sexuality is, now I know I'm gay at 14. I fall in love with my best friend. This is problematic for me because I don't know what to do with these feelings. There's no music over here that's expressing this. There's nowhere I can go to. But, Earth, Wind, and Fire in the song Imagination isn't talking about a queer experience, but they're talking about love and sensuality being a transcendent one, imagining you and me, a beauty we both can see. Minnie Riperton sings Inside My Love, a carnal desire that transcends spiritual into the spiritual realm. So, for me, that tells me that there's nothing wrong with my sexuality, that my sexuality and the sensuality I aspire to experience is steeped in my spirituality. It's all the same. Where over here is objectified, and I'm a faggot. I am, not one of the boys. I can't affect the swagger. It's hard to walk with my pants down because that hurts my back. Okay? It's hard for me to call my mama and sister and think of them as hoes and bitches and tricks because these were women who saved me when the men were not in the community. How could I now call my mama a bitch or think of her as anything less than the powerful woman she was who made her way out of no way? And where's this angst coming from? This isn't sustaining. This isn't affirming. And the statistics are showing us that it's not. It's showing us that a lot of us are catching HIV and AIDS more than we should, given the information that's out here, is showing us that the people who didn't transcend the gangster rap that they were ascribing to as teenagers now have children who are doing some of the same things that they were doing in the 90s, who are in gangs, who are violent, and there's no soul. There's no soul. If that's missing, that wasn't in the music. The music isn't, of course, direct cause. There's a lot of socio-political elements here and layers and patterns of abuse that are, part of the family and part of the society at large. It's much bigger than the music, but then the music is a part of it. It's part of the culture milieu. It's what has sustained us, marginalized, disenfranchised people for centuries. So why is this music not speaking to my condition? Why is it not speaking messages of healing to my existence? So I'm having to go back over here. The production values are dated. No one is using wah-wah guitar anymore. No one is using orchestras behind their music. No one has a 15 to 16-minute intro like Isaac Hayes does. But, but there's something still affirming here. There's something in the way that Bobby Womack growls that reminds me of my uncles. There's something in the way that Gladys Knight sings that reminds me of the women at church in the alto section, that there's something sustaining, that this is not what this will pass. This will pass, my child. And that's even said in the music. Philadelphia International, there's these strutting strings and orchestrations and people like Lou Rawls and the OJs affirming messages, political and personal. The personal becomes the political. Political becomes the personal. It's all about this confluence of an affirmation. And black people know this well, but there's some disconnect here. I'm not understanding. So do I make this reconciliation? I stop making the reconciliation. There's no need for me to reconcile any of this because there's nothing to reconcile. It's absolutely an art form over here, but with any art, there are responsibilities for messages you put out there. It may not have been what you intended. And it's interesting that 20 plus years from now, these same people who were delivering these messages are now multimillionaires. They sent their children to private schools. Ice Cube is making movies for children now and for families. So there's an evolution. They evolved out of that, and they certainly made their money off of it. But what about the kids who were listening to those cassettes who were on the bus with me? Some of them are dead now, and some of them who lived and who were able to make it through don't go to that music as some sort of, let's go back to when we were getting shot at the skating rink and gin and juice was on the radio. They don't bring back those nice, glowing, warm feelings that, maybe a Carole King song does for my parents' generation. So what is the soundtrack that we cling to? What soundtrack do I cling to as a disenfranchised, marginalized queer person? Where it's steeped in homophobia over here, but there's some sort of love over here, regardless of who I am and where I come from. So here, I'm able to find who I am and able to embrace who I am, and thankful to the music that my father left, who died of his own of his own demons. And a lot of these people who passed on these records and people I remember at these card parties and who danced the most and who sang the most and who responded to Lenny Williams or who responded to Al Green, they succumbed to some of their vices too. And there's a sadness there, but there was still something that I could look at what not to be and who not to be. And over here I knew that I wasn't going to be that. The onus was on me to take from this culture that is definitely mine and make myself into who I was going to be, which was going to be somebody who was going to see that vulnerability is not a weakness. In fact, it's a strength, that you have the courage to step out in this world and be affirmed that you are somebody. Johnny Taylor told me that on the record that Daddy had, Mavis Staples communicated to me that if you don't respect yourself, nobody's going to give a good to hoot, which is all very true. And as a culture critic, I've had the opportunity to meet these people. Now, granted, Shaka Khan didn't remember half of the sessions she did for the songs that changed my life, but given that I was still able to tell her, thank you for that. I talked to Al Green. He spoke about himself in third person. Very interesting personality, but still, he gave me music and I was able to tell him, thank you. I talked to Mavis Staples, and I said, you know what? Your music sustained me at a time when I thought that I was not going to be here. I was able to tell Mavis, thank you. And she said, you're welcome. Thank you.